Alrighty, in this video we're going to start looking at actually mapping methods. So we're able to map components, which is great, but we haven't actually looked at mapping individual methods. And I think what we're going to be doing with that is we're going to be working with the mapped component class in a similar way that we worked with the component map class. So basically, what we need to do is we need to extend this class to handle the concept of mapping methods to it. So as always, we'll first go ahead and look at our tests. We'll write a couple tests. The tests will mostly mirror what we've already done. And then once we do that, then we'll write the code out, make sure the tests pass, and all that great stuff. So again, we're just going piece by piece for our mapped component map. Let's go ahead and I'm going to introduce another interface. Say interface iTest component 2, and I'm going to go ahead and put on a method. So I'm going to say void method, and that's all I'm going to do. So this interface has a method. We're going to map this component, and then we are going to try to map this method, figure out how we want to go about doing it. Again, it'll look very similar to the way that we've mapped components. So keep this definition of this interface in mind. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and start writing some tests for mapping methods. I'm going to go ahead and say public void, let's see here, manually maps methods to components. And this is going to take in a type component type. Actually, no, we're not testing that, so I'm not going to parameterize that. Instead, I'm going to say, let's just do by ID. Let's just map the same method for every test case, but just change the ID every time. So I'm going to turn this into a test. We're going to have a test case, and we're going to pass in byte.min value. We're going to have another test case. We're going to pass in byte.max value. We're going to have another test case, and we're going to pass in 153, just an arbitrary number, might as well be consistent. Then do another test case of 1. So that should give us a nice spread of different values that we can use. Okay, so how do we go about mapping a method? Well, we need to start off with a component map first. So I'm going to say var component map equals new component map. Then I'm going to go ahead and map a component. So I'm going to say var component equals component map dot map component type of iTest component 2 with the ID of, let's say, 4. Just an arbitrary number I chose. Now I'm going to say var method equals component dot map method. So what do we pass into map method? Well, just like how we pass in types into the map components, we're going to pass in method infos to map methods. So I'm going to say type of, actually I'm just going to say var method info equals type of iTest component dot get method, did I do method or method 1? I just called it method. So we're going to do type of iTest component get method, which will return the method info that refers to the method on that interface. So now I'm going to say method equals component.map method, passing in the method info and then the ID that I want to map it to. Now let's go ahead and insert. So I'm going to say method.id should be ID, method dot, or whoops, I don't want to do that. I want to say var method equals component dot methods at ID. Then I want to say method dot ID should be ID, and method dot type should be type of, or sorry, I'm going to do method dot component should be component. And then method should be method info. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we invoke the map method on the component, passing in the method info we want to map as well as the ID. Then we extract the method, which will be another additional class, from component.methods, which will be a array of of these mapped methods. And then we make sure the ID is correct. We make sure that the method has a reference back to its parent component. This is really important because in a variety of locations within our code base, we might run into situations where we have a mapped method object, but we need to retrieve the actual component type it was mapped for. So I want to have a reference back to its parent component embedded into the mapped method itself. Then I'm going to do method.method should be method info, because the method property of the method is going to be the method info it was mapped as. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up the test. It gives us a pretty good blueprint as to what we're going to have to do. So the first thing we're going to have to do is I'm going to go into mapped component, and I'm just going to go ahead and write out code basically following the same thing we did with the component map. I mean, I really don't need to even have the class yet written, because it's so straightforward code basically that we've already written that I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to say public mapped method array methods get private set. Then in the constructor, I'm going to say methods equals new mapped methods, or mapped method, byte.maxValue plus 1. Then I'm going to say public mapped method, method info, which will pull in system.reflection, method byte ID. Then I'm going to say method, or var method, or sorry, first I'm just going to go ahead and throw the check in for an existing ID already. So I'm going to say if methods at ID does not equal null, throw new argument exception, method ID already mapped. Then I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to change this parameter name actually to method info to differentiate it from the local variable I'm about to create. So I'm going to say var method equals new mapped method. I'm going to pass in a reference back to this for the component that we're instantiating. Then I'm going to pass in the method info that we are mapping the method for, and then the ID that we're mapping the method to. Then I'm going to say methods at ID equals method, and then I'm going to say return method. All right, so really the only thing we have left to do to make this particular test pass is going to be to write the mapped method class. So I'm going to come up here back to our infrastructure namespace, and I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to say mapped method. Now the mapped method class is going to have a constructor, and it's going to take in a component map, or sorry, a mapped component. I'm going to call it component. It's going to take in a method info, which will pull in system.reflection, method info. I think I'm going to call it method info instead, the actual property name. I'll update that in the test here momentarily. And I'm going to say byte ID. So component, method info, byte ID. I'm just turning these into little properties. Maybe move the ID property up to the top. I always think that looks better when if you have a property called ID that is at the top. I don't know why. Anyway, yeah, so those are our three properties, and those are our three constructor parameters, and the properties are assigned to the constructor parameters. So that makes this entire class compile, which is what we want. We also get a method return values never used. That's fine. Let's jump back into our component map tests. The only thing that we have a problem with is I actually changed what I wanted this property to be called. I don't want it to be called method. I want it to be called method info. Method info, it looks like the method info type does not have the B. So it looks like it wants one of these guys. I guess we just do should be same as. Asserts that an object reference refers to the exact same object as another object reference, which is what we want. Okay, so that's that test. Let's go ahead and run all of these. And we get success. So that test works. Now let's go ahead and ensure that we get that error if there are methods that aren't, or we're trying to assign the same method twice. So public void, how did I do that? Mapping, okay. Mapping to methods with same ID throws exception. We'll arrange with a component map equals new component map. Var component equals component map dot map component type of iTest component for then let's say component dot map method type of iTest component, or sorry, I want iTest component 2 dot get method assign this to 1. And then let's do the exact same thing, except I'm going to do method 2 right here. So I'm actually going to add a new method to our iTest component 2. I'm of course going to wrap this in a delegate. So I'm going to say fail. Then I'm going to say fail should throw exception. Okay, to make this code actually do what I want it to, I need to ensure that method 2 exists on the iTest component 2 interface. So I'm going to hit F12 to jump up here, and I'm going to add a new method called method 2. Scroll down, and then let's go ahead and run this test. And we should get a success, and we do. So we are throwing in that particular case. I also want to add in another thing. I want to go ahead and make sure that we can only map methods that are method infos on the type of the component that the mapped method is of. So let's go ahead and say test public void mapping method requires that method exists on parent component. So what do I mean by what I just said? Because I just realized that what I just said may be slightly nonsensical. Well, consider this code. If I say component map equals new component map, and then I say var component equals component map dot map component type of iTest component 4, then I say component dot map method type of iTest component 2 dot get method 5, this should throw an error. The reason this should throw an error is I am now mapping a method info on a component that was mapped to a different type. So what I want to do is I want to say var fail equals this code, or sorry, action fail equals that code, fail dot should throw exception. I want this to fail because I don't want to be able to map a method on a component that doesn't have that type, or doesn't have, you know what I mean. Now if I hit run, you'll notice it'll fail. It fails because it succeeded when it shouldn't have. So basically what I need to do is add an additional check to ensure that when I map a method, the method info has the same declaring type as the type that this component was mapped as. So going back up to mapped component, what I can do is immediately after this check, I can say if method info dot declaring type does not equal type, throw new argument exception, method must be declared on component type method info. Now let's run all of our tests again, make sure we didn't mess anything up, and we should get success on everything, hopefully. Eventually, once Visual Studio gets back from. There we go. Now we get a bunch of these errors. Wow. It turns out I actually had this exact error condition already codified into this test. So this test was actually problematic to begin with. It just didn't fail until I added that additional check. You'll notice here that I'm doing method info equals iTest component dot get method right here, which is interesting because that actually should return null if I'm not mistaken. It does. We mapped a null method info. All right, so let's go ahead and type in iTest component 2 get method, and let's hit run, and we get success. Okay, I want to write 2 more tests, and I'm just going to write 2 of these tests, and then I'm going to just fill in the rest of the code, because what I'm about to write will be pretty much exactly what we wrote already for our component map. So the first test I'm going to write is test I'm just going to grab these test cases, and then I'm going to say public void can get mapped method via method info byte method ID. So let's arrange var component map equals new component map var component equals component map dot map component type of itest component 2, which is important that I do that, 4. And then I'm going to say var method equals component dot map method type of itest component 2. Actually, I'm just going to alias this out into a variable. I'm going to say method info equals itest component 2 get method method. I'm going to say map method method info and then the byte ID method ID. Then I'm going to say component dot get method method info should be method. So this basically ensures that we have the same reference being returned when we invoke the get method method, which we haven't written yet, but we will here shortly. The last thing I want to do, the last test I want to write before I go ahead and fix up all this code, is say public void mapping 2 methods with same method info throws exception. So var component map equals new component map, var component equals component map dot map component type of itest component 2. Then let's go ahead and say var method info equals type of itest component 2 dot get method method. Then I'm going to say component dot map method method info 4 component dot map, or sorry, var fail equals component dot map method method info 5. Now fail, I did it again, didn't I? Let's make sure that we have that set as action. Fail should throw exception. Alright, so this is just ensuring that if we try to map 2 components, then we get an error. You'll also notice that I'm not copying and pasting code that I could copy and paste to make this go a little faster, and the reason I'm doing that is I'm wanting to make sure that this API feels right. I really want to make sure that this component map is easy to work with, makes sense, and is straightforward. So I'm kind of wanting to get the experience of typing it out as much as I can so that I start to sort of evaluate it to make sure that like I said, it feels natural. So again, I would normally copy and paste, but I really want to get the feel of this API down as well as I can, because this is such an important aspect to this entire RPC framework and to the entire MMO project at large. Anyway, the way that we implement these 2 tests is going to be just doing exactly what we did already with our component map, and that is introducing a dictionary. So I'm going to say private read-only dictionary, which will bring in system collections generic, of type method info mapped method, and I'll call this methods. I'll jump down to mapped component, methods equals that. Or no, I'm going to call this method infos to methods. That's what I'm going to call this. Then on the map method info, or sorry, map method method, I'm going to say method infos to method dot add method info method. Just like what we did before, taking note to do this before we actually perform something that results in a side effect. Finally, I need to implement the mapped, mapped method get method of method info method, return method infos to method. All right, let's go ahead and hit run all on our tests and see if, yep, they all succeed. Alrighty, so I think that about wraps up what I wanted to do. We now have a data structure that can contain a relationship between components and methods and IDs. So we'll see you guys in the next video.